remarks, we'll try to take a few questions. First, I want to introduce the three people who have joined me today for this announcement. Assistant Attorney General Kristen Clark of the Civil Rights Division, Special Agent in Charge Doug DePodesta of the Memphis FBI Field Office, and First Assistant United States Attorney Reagan Fondren. Almost 8 months ago, I stood at this podium to announce that our office, together with the Civil Rights Division, had opened a criminal civil rights investigation into the circumstances leading to the tragic death of Tyre Nichols. I said that the investigation would be thorough and methodical, and that, as with any other investigation, we would go where the facts led us. That day, I also made a point to say that we care deeply about potential violations of constitutional rights here in my hometown. And I told the citizens of Memphis that I want this city to be a place where justice is done. To do justice, we must ensure that everyone's civil rights are protected. Earlier this afternoon, a federal grand jury returned an indictment charging 5 former Memphis police officers with violating Tyre Nichols' civil rights, resulting in Mr. Nichols' death. The indictment also charges those same 5 defendants with obstruction of justice. The 5 defendants are Emmett Martin III, Tadarius Bean, Demetrius Haley, Desmond Mills Jr., and Justin Smith. In a moment, I will discuss the specific charges against the defendants, but first, I would like to invite Assistant Attorney General Clark to the podium.
Thank you, U.S. Attorney Ritz, and good afternoon. I'm Kristen Clark, and I lead the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice. The Justice Department has brought federal civil rights criminal charges against 5 former Memphis Police Department detectives involved in the tragic death of Tyre Nichols. The charges allege that 5 former Scorpion team detectives used excessive force, resulting in the death of Mr. Nichols, that they aided and abetted each other in using that excessive force, and that they failed to intervene to stop that excessive force. We also allege that after they used excessive force on Mr. Nichols, the detectives failed to render medical aid or to advise the dispatcher and emergency medical personnel of Mr. Nichols' serious medical needs, even as his condition deteriorated and as he became unresponsive. As time passed at the arrest scene, the defendants discussed striking Mr. Nichols, hitting him with straight haymakers, and taking turns hitting him, information that they failed to tell EMTs and paramedics. We also charge all 5 detectives with conspiring to and taking overt action to cover up their misconduct. As Americans, our Constitution gives us certain basic rights when we interact with law enforcement officers. We have a right to be free from unreasonable force, a right to have other officers intervene to stop the unlawful assault, and a right, when in police custody, to have urgent medical needs appropriately addressed and not met with deliberate indifference. These rights define a standard of conduct that police officers must meet, a standard that we enforce across the country at the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department. Enforcing that standard is one of our highest priorities for 2 reasons. First, our obligation to protect people's constitutional rights, and second, our mission to ensure effective policing in our communities. Effective policing requires public trust. We all know that police officers have challenging jobs and that most officers carry out their jobs with honesty, dedication, and integrity. But when some officers violate the Constitution, when they use excessive force, when they ignore serious injuries inflicted on people they arrest, their actions erode the public's trust. At the Civil Rights Division, one of our highest priorities is to ensure law enforcement accountability and to preserve and restore the public's faith in law enforcement. The statistics speak for themselves. Since January of 2021, the Justice Department has brought more than 100 prosecutions involving violations of constitutional and legal rights by law enforcement officials. And in that same period, we obtained more than 86 convictions. We will never stop working to fulfill our duty to protect Americans from unlawful acts of police violence. We will work to hold offenders accountable because in our country, no one is above the law. I pledge to you, as Attorney General Garland often says, that we will follow the facts and the law, and we will seek to ensure that our system of justice lives up to its name. Note that the charges announced today are separate from the Justice Department's civil pattern or practice investigation into the Memphis Police Department opened this past July. The charges announced today are criminal, while the pattern or practice investigation is a civil matter that will be conducted separately and independently from the criminal case. Earlier today, I sat down with Tyre Nichols' mother and father to convey my sympathy for their loss. I extend my deepest condolences to Tyre's family and to all of those who knew him and loved him. It is tragic to see a life cut short at 29 with so many milestones unmet, so many words unsaid, and so much potential unfulfilled. Tyre Nichols should be alive today. No one in this country should have to bury a loved one because of police violence. The Justice Department will never stop working to fulfill our duty to protect the American people from excessive and unlawful use of force by officials acting under color of law. Since this tragic incident occurred, the Civil Rights Division has been working alongside prosecutors from the U.S. Attorney's Office as well as FBI agents here in Memphis, and I want to thank this team for working so hard in investigating this case and guiding it through our system of justice. I'll note that the defendants are presumed innocent under our law, and now the federal criminal process will take its course. I now turn the podium back over to U.S. Attorney Ritz, who will describe the indictment in further detail. Thank you.
Thank you, Assistant Attorney General Clark. I want to go through the specifics of the charges. The indictment charges all 5 defendants in 4 counts. First, the indictment alleges that the defendants unlawfully assaulted Mr. Nichols and failed to intervene in the unlawful assault. By doing so, they deprived Mr. Nichols of the right to be free from unreasonable force. Second, the indictment alleges that the defendants knew that Mr. Nichols, who was an arrestee in police custody, had a serious medical need, and that they disregarded that medical need by failing to render medical aid and by failing to advise the police dispatcher and emergency medical personnel of the circumstances. By doing so, the defendants deprived Mr. Nichols of the right to be free from a police officer's deliberate indifference to an arrestee's serious medical needs. Third, the indictment alleges that the defendants intentionally conspired to withhold and omit material information and to make false and misleading statements in an effort to cover up the use of unreasonable force on Mr. Nichols. The indictment lists several overt acts in furtherance of this conspiracy, including that the defendants did not tell the MPD dispatcher, an MPD supervisor, Memphis Fire Department EMTs, or Memphis Fire Department paramedics that they knew Mr. Nichols had been struck repeatedly, that the defendants used their body-worn cameras in such a way as to limit the capture of evidence at the arrest scene, and that the defendants provided false and misleading information about the arrest scene for the official incident report. Finally, the indictment alleges that the defendants obstructed justice by providing false and misleading information and withholding material information in their communications with a police supervisor and a police detective, both of whom were tasked with writing reports on the arrest of Tyre Nichols. As the Assistant Attorney General said, these charges, of course, as with any criminal case, the indictment contains allegations only, and defendants are presumed innocent until proven guilty. I want to say that the first two counts, alleging civil rights violations resulting in death, carry a sentence of up to life in prison, and the other two counts, the obstruction of justice counts, carry a potential prison sentence of up to 20 years in prison. I also want to say thank you to the dedicated team of prosecutors and law enforcement agents who are working on this case. This case is being handled by my office's newly formed National Security and Civil Rights Unit, working hand in hand with the Civil Rights Division. I'm proud of our team and proud of their commitment to protecting the civil rights of all Americans. Now we are able to take just a few questions.
Do you anticipate further charges?
At this time, we would not comment on the existence or status of any criminal investigation. We are here to announce that the 5 defendants that we've charged today have been charged in this indictment.
Bria Jones, News Channel 3. Can you explain the weight that these charges have over the current criminal charges here in Shelby County and how this could impact the ongoing legal proceedings here?
Yes, these cases would be handled on separate tracks. It's 2 different systems. So the state charges would be handled in state court, federal charges here in federal court. And the state court and the state system over there would set the trial date and things like that. Over here in the federal system, the same thing would happen, and we're not going to make any predictions today about how that timeline might emerge.
So we're seeing that the DOJ is already conducting these interviews with people in the Memphis community about their experience with Scorpion Unit and MPD. Did that contribute to these charges at all, or is that separate, like the pattern of practice?
The Justice Department is actively conducting community meetings and gathering information in the course of carrying out its civil pattern or practice investigation into the Memphis Police Department. We look forward to continuing to hear from the community as that investigation takes its course, but we will underscore that that is a separate investigation from the criminal charges that we're announcing today.
Final question.
Do you expect a hearing tomorrow or very soon?
Mr. Saines, I believe in the federal case, we expect that the defendants would be making their initial appearance in the coming days. Thank you all for being here.
All right, there we have it, the news conference by Kevin G. Ritz, the United States Attorney for the Western District of Tennessee, and Kristen Clark, who oversees the Civil Rights Division of the United States Department of Justice, an important player and Assistant Attorney General to Merrick Garland, who is the Attorney General of the United States. Merrick Garland had a statement about this case today. We're going to have that for you momentarily, but first we want to have some comments from defense attorneys, beginning with Blake Ballin, who represents police officer Desmond Mills, and I believe we have his quote ready for us here. Yes, there it is. We have been expecting this federal indictment, Blake Ballin says of this news conference today, and it does not change Mr. Mills' position. As in the state case, Mr. Mills maintains his innocence. He will turn himself in on the federal indictment and continue to defend himself against all allegations in both the state and federal court systems. And also, we have a statement from Bill Massey, who's a prominent Memphis lawyer along with Mr. Ballin. Emmett Martin's attorney says, quote, Emmett Martin, of course, being one of the former officers involved in the Tyre Nichols case, I and my team will be representing Emmett Martin in the federal indictment. We have been expecting it, and we are ready to move forward. And now we have with us Memphis defense attorney Michael Working, who joins us now with a breakdown of today's indictment and the charges against all the 5 former officers. Mr. Working, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule and being with us today. Just to be clear, you do not have a defendant in this case. You do not have a dog in this hunt, right?
Correct.
Very good. All right. Tell me what your initial reaction is to the indictment.
Well, at first, I think everyone was expecting this. One of the things that surprises a lot of people who are not in the law is when the federal government and the state government both charge these officers. Why is that not double jeopardy? It's not considered double jeopardy if a different government in this case the federal government and the state government, charge. The legal concept is called different sovereigns. And then secondly, in state court, they are facing different charges: murder, aggravated kidnapping, and those charges. Whereas in the federal court, it is related to civil rights violations.
All right. Well, we heard today from Kristen Clark, who is the Assistant Attorney General to Merrick Garland, and Kevin Ritz, who is the U.S. Attorney for the Western District of Tennessee, about this indictment. And this indictment was produced here in Memphis in the Western District. It says at the very headline of this came out of Memphis and not Washington, D.C. One of the things that I thought was interesting was that they call them detectives in the indictment. We've been calling them officers, the former officers, but they were part of the Scorpion unit, and the Justice Department is alleging they were detectives, which is a grade up from a street officer, correct?
Generally, and there's a difference between, I guess, your duty as an officer and then your official rank. It's not necessarily that they always coincide, but I believe a lot of these officers were actually sergeants. And then, detective has to do with a higher level of supervision, a higher level of expectation of what you know as an officer and what you know to be the right thing.
All right, it's not every day that we hear from Merrick Garland, the Attorney General of the United States, on a Memphis case. But this case generated comments from President Biden. He said, and I quote, he was outraged and deeply pained by the death of Tyre Nichols. We saw Kamala Harris, the Vice President of the United States, at Tyre Nichols' funeral, and we saw numerous celebrities and Reverend Al Sharpton and numerous other prominent people in America step forward after this case that outraged the nation. Let's hear now from Merrick Garland, the Attorney General of the United States, about today's indictment. Listen in.
Today, the Justice Department informed the family of Tyre Nichols that we have charged 5 former Memphis police detectives with federal crimes in connection with the death of Mr. Nichols. United States Attorney Kevin Ritz and Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights Kristen Clark will detail those charges shortly. On January 7th of this year, Tyre Nichols was just minutes away from home when he was pulled over by law enforcement officers sworn to protect him. As the indictment charges, the defendants in this case, who at the time were serving as detectives with the Memphis Police Department, brutally beat Mr. Nichols. They then failed to render medical aid to Mr. Nichols and further failed to tell emergency responders that they had struck him repeatedly, even as his condition deteriorated and he became unresponsive. We also allege that while Mr. Nichols lay dying in a hospital, the defendants conspired to cover up their crimes, including by falsely stating that Mr. Nichols had actively resisted arrest. Weeks after Mr. Nichols' death, the Memphis Police Department released body camera footage of the incident. The country watched in horror as Mr. Nichols was kicked, punched, tased, and pepper sprayed. We all heard Mr. Nichols cry out for his mother and say, quote, "I'm just trying to go home." We allege that the defendants charged today willfully deprived Tyre Nichols of his constitutional rights and that their actions resulted in his death. Tyre Nichols should be alive today. I want to express my deep condolences to Mr. Nichols' loved ones as they continue to grieve the loss of their beloved son, father, brother, grandson, and friend. Officers who violate the civil rights of those they are sworn to protect undermine public safety, which depends on the community's trust in law enforcement. They dishonor their fellow officers who do their work with integrity every day. The Justice Department will continue to hold accountable officers who betray their oath.
All right, that was Merrick Garland, the Attorney General of the United States, commenting on today's indictment of the 5 former Memphis police officers, former detectives, as the indictment calls them, in the death and the depriving of civil rights of Mr. Nichols Allegedly, according to this indictment. All right, we had Bria Bolden down at the news conference today. Bria, tell us what's the scene there now.
Well, the scene is mostly cleared out of here by now. We're at the federal building in downtown Memphis today. What really struck me was U.S. Attorney Kevin Ritz saying that this announcement comes 8 months after their original announcement that they were opening up an investigation into Tyre Nichols' death. He did say these federal indictments were returned by a grand jury today. I'm going to go through and read the counts for everybody. Assistant Attorney General Kristen Clark had said these are federal civil rights criminal charges, including excessive force, and they are also alleging that the former officers aided and abetted excessive force. They failed to intervene and failed to offer medical aid to Tyre Nichols. They also say these officers conspired to take action They conspired together, and tried to cover the misconduct that happened on that scene in Hickory Hill, where Tyre Nichols eventually ended up losing his life in the hospital. I did reach out to two of the former officers' attorneys, Bill Massey and Blake Ballin. They represent Desmond Mills in Blake Ballin's case and Bill Massey in Emmett Martin's case. They did tell me that they were expecting these indictments to come and that their clients will be turning themselves in. We don't have a TBA on when that is happening, but once we find out, we will let you guys find out. Again, federal indictments coming down for the former Memphis police officers that have been charged in Tyre Nichols' death. Joe, I'm going to toss it back to you.
Thank you, Bria Bolden, live from the federal building. Back now with Michael Working, a Memphis defense attorney who has handled many important cases, criminal defense attorney who deals in this whole world of these kinds of things, an indictment. And this is certainly a very serious one. If you were a lawyer for one of these former officers, former detectives, what would you be doing now?
Well, they've been planning their strategies for months in this case, knowing that this is coming. And no, I haven't ever been in a case so serious that the United States Attorney General made a statement or the president. But in this case, they've known this is coming. The federal grand jury process, the federal indictment, usually takes a lot longer than in state court. And so they've been working many different angles to see if there's even the possibility to work out some joint agreement. And they're planning their state court defenses in a way that doesn't make any sort of admission or cost them points over in federal court, and vice versa. So it's a very tricky tightrope that these attorneys have to walk who are defending the officers. And it's something that they have certainly been planning out since the indictments in state court came down back in January.
Well, the Memphis case is the Tyre Nichols case. The Louisville case is the Breonna Taylor case. The Minneapolis Twin Cities case is the George Floyd case. And you observed that in the George Floyd case, the former officers who are now doing time suffered some serious penalties for simply observing the attack that was made by one officer on George Floyd. So this tracks the George Floyd case factually and some of the legal theories quite a bit. The most famous officer in the Minneapolis case with George Floyd involved Derek Chauvin, who knelt on his neck for 9.5 minutes. He was the officer who was alleged to have inflicted the most physical harm on Mr. Floyd. He pled guilty after losing in state court, and by pleading guilty was entitled to a reward of a little bit less punishment for accepting responsibility. He still got a 22-year sentence. There were two officers in the George Floyd case who were on their first week of the job and just did crowd control but never laid a hand on George Floyd. They each got 3.5 years. And all of the officers in this case are alleged to have inflicted physical harm on Tyre Nichols and appear to be situated much more like Derek Chauvin in the George Floyd case. And it's your anticipation that these officers may be incarcerated after these indictments are processed and they go into custody?
So right now they're out on bond in the state court case. It's very possible that the federal government would move to keep them detained and held in jail during the case. The penalty, which on the last page of this indictment, for several federal civil rights violations, are any term up to life in prison or death. Now, no one sought the death penalty in the George Floyd case. I highly doubt the federal government would do that in this case. The federal government, even in Western Tennessee, is still highly dependent on Memphis police officers and local law enforcement to be their witnesses in cases they're prosecuting. So it may be hard that they would even give a life sentence, but in the federal system, they sentence by months. And in this case, usually 360 months, I believe is the math, is 30 years.
Yes.
And that is considered effectively a life sentence. Derek Chauvin got pretty close to that.
22
in
years.
22 years. I can't add the months on that, but it's like 275, something like that, quite a bit.
Well, thank you, Mike Working. We really appreciate the opportunity to talk with an expert at a moment like this. And so right now, I'm just going to go through the timeline of what happened, just so you remember. And let's share a picture of Tyre Nichols, the person who we've been talking about here. He was 29 years old, a FedEx second shift worker who went to his mother's home in southeast Memphis at 7 o'clock in the middle of his shift to have dinner each night. He had his mother's name, Ro Vaughn, tattooed on his arm. He was a skateboarder who loved sunsets and photography. 29 years old, he had a 4-year-old son. And so what happened to him was on January 7th, he was pulled over at Rains and Ross Road in southeastern Shelby County. A confrontation occurred right there. And as we saw on the police videos, Nichols ran away. And then there was another confrontation that just happened to be 100 yards from Tyre Nichols' mother's home. Well, on January 10th, Tyre Nichols died in the hospital. On January 15th, MPD internal investigation was announced. On January 6th, rights attorney Ben Crump announced his hiring by Ro Vaughn Wells and her husband Rodney Wells, who is Tyre's stepfather, who we've all seen those parents there. The U.S. Justice Department opened their civil rights investigation of Tyre Nichols' death on January 18th. And what we saw today from Kristen Clark, I should say, and Kevin Ritz was the fruit of that investigation. This several-point indictment that accuses the officers of the violation of Tyre Nichols' rights and his death. On January 20th, all 5 officers were fired. So literally 10 days after Tyre Nichols' death, all 5 of these officers were fired after the MPD revealed the 5 officers violated department policies in Nichols' death. January 24th, the Memphis Fire Department started relieving firefighters of duty for their, frankly, lack of action, allegedly, when they saw the situation in southeast Memphis and Tyre Nichols' condition. January 26th, the 5 officers were arrested and charged with second-degree murder and other charges. So literally 16 days after Tyre Nichols' death, these officers were arrested. On January 27th, we all watched. Mike Working was here with us that night as we watched the videos that are so horrific. There we see Tyre skateboarding, one of his real passions. February 1st, the funeral happened, and it was led by Reverend Al Sharpton, and Kamala Harris, Vice President of the United States, was here to comment and called for justice in America and justice for Tyre Nichols. So that's the situation. Action News 5 is going to be presenting complete coverage of this story for you on our broadcast coming up at 4, 5, 6 o'clock, and of course at 10 o'clock tonight. Coming up next, Investigate TV. This is our gray television investigative report that you need to see every day right here on this station. Stay tuned. We'll have more coverage of the indictment coming up today.